It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Stuart Findlay of the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. His research interests span habitats and ecological processes in aquatic ecosystems with a strong emphasis on bringing information to management and application. He has studied streams, wetlands, and rivers with a focus on the Hudson Valley, New York. Today, Stuart will talk about submerged vegetation in the Hudson, lessons from a major disturbance. Thanks, Stuart.
Okay, thanks everybody. And thanks for the opportunity to speak to the group this morning and everyone for coming out on what, at least for us, is a bit of a snowy morning. So the topic I want to talk about today is some interaction amongst species in the tidal freshwater Hudson River. And the study region is essentially from about Tappan Zee up to the head of tide at Troy. So it's a very large area, and there's intense public interest and natural resource interest in what's going on here. One of the differences in the kinds of things I'm going to talk about in the next 15 minutes or so is that these are interactions between a native and an invasive that have been undoubtedly going on for decades to over 100 years. So this is not similar to much of what we hear about with invasive species, where there tends to be attention, rightly so, on the wave of invasion and very short-term effects and rapid changes and things coming and going and consequences. Both these plants have been here in the case of the native, which is water celery, undoubtedly for thousands of years, and in the case of water chestnut, the invasive, certainly for decades and probably about 100, 150 years. So these interactions have been occurring for a long time. And the point of today is that we suffered a major disturbance, and I don't want to make it sound like that's a good thing, but it did give us an opportunity to sort of open up some avenues of inquisition and learn some new things about what's going on that I think are informative for the sort of general topic of what are we going to do about these invasive species problems. And I'll come back to sort of bigger picture stuff right at the end. So as I alluded to, the species I want to talk about are a native, which is water celery Vallisneria americana. It's widespread across the Northeast and the rest of the country, and the genus at least around the world. And that is the predominant submerged species in the tidal freshwater in the Hudson. It's probably 80 to 90% of the biomass that's truly submerged in the river. There are a variety of other species that we can talk about if you're interested. And the major invasive species we have plenty, but the major one we have, and the one most people know about, is the water chestnut, Trapinatans, which again has been here for quite a long time. We're fortunate because of our sort of ecosystem level studies of the Hudson that we know quite a lot about both these species, and we've gone through studies of how much is out there, what are the ecological processes they interact with, and how have they changed over time. And the change over time is really going to be the key to sort of again unlocking some of these other questions that might not have been so obvious to us if we had just focused on the brand new invaders. And unfortunately, we have some of those as well. So very quickly and broad brush, just to sort of set some of the characteristics of these plants. Across the top, I contrast the native and the exotic, and just a couple of attributes where they actually have differing effects. So the submerged Vallisneria provides oxygen to the water column, which in many aquatic systems is considered a good thing. The exotic water chestnut, in some situations, but not all situations, it actually depletes oxygen from the water column, which again is largely considered a bad thing for a component of the ecosystem to do. In contrast, the Vallisneria is not very good at reducing turbidity. Many underwater plants are capable of maintaining higher water clarity because of slowing currents, etc. Vallisneria is not capable of doing that in this situation, whereas water chestnut's very good. And the water you see coming out of one of these beds as the tide exits the larger trap of beds is crystal clear. And for most people, they think that's good. Both these plants have fairly high habitat value. They have abundant fishes and invertebrates that use them as habitat and undoubtedly places to live. They're different fishes and different invertebrates. So the issue of, which fish you like and which fish you don't like would have to weigh into whether you think, one plant is wearing a white hat and one plant is wearing a black hat. But they've been around a long time and people are sort of used to them, whether they like them or not. As I think everybody knows, one of the reasons people really dislike water chestnut is the impact on recreational access. And this is an aerial image of a marina site where they've gone out and cut channels for access for both small and large pleasure craft to get out to the main channel of the Hudson. This particular site, they actually went through and tried to clear cut the entire site, which, I wish them luck on that. But there is, certainly good justification and approaches to manage the plant in small areas, again, primarily for recreational access. Our studies have gone on for over 25 years, and the sort of inventory piece of this has two components. The repetitive annual information we have comes from a group of dedicated volunteers who go out in kayaks, small boats, and they go to various places that we ask them to go to, and there's an established protocol for doing observations and reporting, and we get this every year, and it allows us to describe year to year interannual variation in the abundance of this plant, water celery in particular. We don't ask them to go into the water chestnut beds because they wouldn't do that. But we do get annual information on the water celery from these volunteers. And then about every 5 years, the state pays for a complete aerial inventory with interpretation and generation of GIS layers and all this sort of stuff that's used both for science and public information as well as regulatory to manage these plants. We have two different scales. The interannual stuff gives us the finest breakdown of what's happening, but the inventory is the most complete and most quantitative. So we know what's out here, and we know it changes. There have been small scale changes documented over the last 15 years, and then probably many of you in the Northeast will remember Tropical Storm Irene, closely followed by Tropical Storm Lee, about the end of the growing season in 2011. And it had huge impact. Lots of things changed in the Hudson because of this, but if you look at the photos on the right, it's clear that there were big changes in turbidity, water clarity, as well as sediment delivery. And it turns out that this sediment delivery in particular was very damaging to the water celery. And I'll show you the data in a second, but there was an almost complete extirpation of water celery from the study reach I spoke about, which again is about 150 kilometers long from Troy down to the Tappan Zee region. So a big effect. This sort of thing has probably happened before. It's never been documented, but a big effect on the plants. And again, our on the water volunteer data give us the clearest picture of what's happened here. The volunteer data go back to about 2000. I'm just showing you from pre-Irene out to current year observations. And basically the y-axis is what we expect the volunteers to report. We set these up so that they quote unquote should be seeing plants in about 40 to 50% of their points. We anticipate, and we design it so some of the points are outside known areas in case there's expansion. So we anticipate about 40% positives or present reports. And you can see that in the year after Irene, the numbers are way down, something like 85% loss of positive reports from the volunteers. And then not much recovery for 2 or 3 years. And we're back to, as far as these data go, to being close to where we were before Irene, but it's taken a long time. You know, the first 5 years or so, it was really pretty grim, and there was serious debates about, why aren't you guys doing something about this? So these are the volunteer data that give us the best time discrimination of what happened. The inventories give us the best picture of the total coverage of the plants and what happened. So there are 2 bars on here. This does go all the way back to 1997. The dark bar is the invasive trappa, and the shaded gray bar is the water celery, the native plant. And so the water chestnut is fairly stable before Irene and after Irene. You can see the gray bars. There's, again, clear documentation of a big loss of the submerged plant. And the last time point on this graph is photos from 2018, so a couple of years ago. So we clearly see recovery. It's not quite as far along as are shown by the volunteer data, but again, the volunteer data are through 2020, and this lags a couple of years. So we see that this big event had, huge effects on the submerged plants, the water celery. Gradual recovery, natural recovery has occurred and is still occurring, and will probably go on for another year or 2. And the water chestnut sort of shrugged it off, basically. The stability of these coverages suggests to me that this plant is sort of, before Irene, it was kind of at the boundary of its habitat occupation, and after is pretty much the same thing. There is a step change you can probably see between the 2007 inventory and 2014, and a part of that, at least, is due to a boundary change in what the aerial photos picked up. So by and large, we're not seeing wholesale replacement of the submerged plant by the invasive plant. We're not seeing a replacement of the native by the invasive plant. So it's not as though opening up this habitat has created great opportunities for expansion of water chestnut. So big changes, a natural disturbance, if you want to look at it that way, has shown us that, rapid fluctuations in these 2. One plant really took it on the chin, water celery took it on the chin, and trappa is sort of, so what? Here we go. So this prompted us to look hard at what's happening during recovery. And this is a fine scale change analysis that used the GIS laters, and this was done by Sean Carroll. He's a GIS guru. He works with Cooperative Extension here. And he's showing you how much change occurred in this period between about 2014 to 2016, when recovery was just starting to sort of be credible. Coverage roughly doubled in this 2-year interval. We were nowhere near full recovery, but it was obvious that the plant was coming back. And it turns out there are sort of hot spots for this recovery. And up north is where things were changing the fastest. And the northern stretches of the river are above roughly the city of Hudson, for those of you that know the geography. Big recovery, fairly dramatic changes in coverage in this 2-year span. And then a couple of smaller spots downriver. These would be south of Newburgh, where there's, good recovery, but not to the same extent as up north. So what we see from this is that, relatively early on in the recovery process, we've got some areas that really seem to be contributing disproportionately. And whether this is because there were relic populations, which there were up and down the river, or whether the populations in those portions of the river are particularly good at colonization, we can't really tease that out right now. But it did open our eyes to the fact that there are differences in sort of resilience capacity in this plant up and down the river, with some areas apparently contributing more than others. And this led to a whole series of genetic work that was done by folks at University of Maryland, shown here, Miley Neal and Katja Engelhardt, along with a number, probably 5 or 6 different graduate students. And Miley and Katja have the capacity to look at genotypic variation in what, to my admittedly untrained eye, appears to be a homogeneous population. They're capable of using microsatellites to tease apart whether this really is one sort of, monolithic, genetically identical, well-mixed population, or if there's structure to it. And it turns out that there's structure to it. And this heat map is lined up parallel to the study reach, again, from above the head of tide of Troy down to the Tappan Zee region. And the color coding is sort of the results of a cluster analysis, if you will, of where various genotypes occur. And there's pretty clear separation between 3 broad groupings. There's a above head of tide group. There's a group that occurs in the pretty typical freshwater part. And then there's a group that appears where there's brackish water. Whether salinity is really what's driving this or not, we don't know yet, but it does sort of fall along that salinity breakdown. So these plants are not, completely mixing every year genetically. The plants do have sort of what I'm calling home fields, and exactly what that advantage might be, either in terms of colonization or other ecological processes, we don't know yet. But again, this big removal led us to look at whether or not these things actually existed. And it's opened up a bunch of sort of interesting science questions as well as practical questions. And that if you want to do some sort of restoration, you really need to be paying attention to, who's present, exactly who are you dealing with. So the take homes, I hope, are pretty clear. Vallisneria is resilient, but not resistant to this kind of thing. We do have these local sources that may be locally adapted. If we're going to think about restoration to future disturbances, we need to be pretty careful about what we try and kickstart the process with, and try and get the right plants in the right place. The exotic trappa is resistant to this kind of disturbance. It showed no loss and possibly even a slight gain to this, and it's almost certainly due to the seed bank, and I know we're going to hear about the seed bank in a second here. The plant's well established and has both pluses and minuses to it, and I'm convinced it's pretty much at the limit of its expansion. It's not going to go anywhere further. But just to come back to sort of the bigger issues, and we've heard about these throughout this conference as well as this morning, we've got this management portfolio that's a mixture of local firefighting, which is important, and the rapid response, rapid detection, rapid response in particular, are really key to get done. We also need these larger strategies so we don't spend all our time fighting local fires, but we need both. Prevention is key. I didn't hear a lot about that this morning. Many of you probably know there's some opportunity, although I'm not wildly optimistic about doing something about the Erie Canal. And we'll see in the next year or two whether that's really going to come to anything or not. The prevention is often what generates most of the public resistance, so it's kind of a tough thing sometimes. And I'd have to say we're still not really clear on the full costs of management, either prevention or eradication, or inaction, deciding to do nothing. And it'd be nice if we had a better foothold, better foundation for making some of the decisions that are being made. So I'm going to stop there. I believe I'm on time, maybe a minute over, and take questions now, or we'll fill out the chat. However, we need to do this. So thanks, everybody.